Sometimes the person who changes your life is the one you thought you had already left behind. I used to think home never really changed. The streets stayed the same. The old maple tree outside my best friend's house kept growing another ring every year. The porch still creaked beneath the same loose wooden step. Even the mailbox leaned slightly to the left, exactly the way it had when we were kids. That was why I never expected anything unusual when I parked my car in front of Liam's house on a quiet Saturday afternoon. We had planned this weekend for weeks. Football on television, homemade burgers, and an afternoon of laughing about college life before finals arrived. Everything felt familiar as I walked up the driveway carrying a bag of snacks balanced against my hip. I reached the front porch and knocked twice before hearing footsteps on the other side of the door. "Coming," someone called. It was not Liam's voice. I frowned. Maybe his parents were home early. The door slowly opened, and for one impossible second, the entire world seemed to forget how to move. Mason Brooks stood in front of me. He looked older than I remembered, but somehow exactly the same. His light brown hair was shorter now, neatly styled instead of constantly messy. His shoulders were broader beneath a dark navy sweater, and the easy confidence in his posture made him seem even taller than the last time I had seen him. A faint shadow along his jaw gave him a more mature appearance, yet his familiar blue eyes had not changed at all. They widened with the same surprise I felt racing through my chest. Neither of us spoke. My mind struggled to connect the man standing in front of me with the older brother who used to help us build tree forts, drive us to baseball practice, and tease Liam every chance he got. 5 years had passed since Mason moved away for work after graduating from college. 5 years without a single unexpected visit. 5 years of birthdays, holidays, and family cookouts where someone always said, "Maybe Mason will make it next year." I had almost stopped expecting him to come back. "Noah," he finally said, my name sounding strangely familiar in his voice. I blinked. "Mason," that was all I managed to say. It felt ridiculous that a single name could suddenly make every forgotten summer afternoon rush back into my memory. Before either of us could say anything else, Liam appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 soda cans. Finally, he laughed. I was wondering why neither of you came inside. His eyes bounced between us before he grinned. "You both look like you just saw a ghost." Mason chuckled softly, breaking the silence first. "It has been a while." 5 years, Liam corrected. "Can somebody please stop standing in the doorway? Mom made enough food to feed half the neighborhood." We stepped inside together. The house smelled exactly the way it always had, like fresh bread, coffee, and cinnamon. Family photographs still lined the hallway walls. My eyes drifted across one frame showing 3 teenage boys covered in mud after a camping trip. Liam stood in the middle. I stood on one side holding a fishing pole. Mason stood behind us both, smiling as though nothing in the world could ever separate the 3 of us. I found myself staring at the picture longer than I intended. "You remember that trip?" Mason asked quietly beside me. I looked up, surprised he had noticed. "Of course." He smiled, but it carried a hint of sadness I could not quite understand. I kept a copy of that picture. My heart skipped for reasons I could not explain. Before I could ask why, Liam called us into the dining room, completely unaware that one simple sentence had already changed the way I looked at the man who had unexpectedly come home after all these years. Lunch passed in the familiar rhythm that had once defined nearly every weekend of my teenage years. Liam talked endlessly about college classes, neighborhood gossip, and the local baseball team, while his parents laughed at stories I had already heard dozens of times. Everything felt comfortably predictable except for one quiet difference sitting across the table. Mason barely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. He smiled politely, listened carefully, and occasionally laughed at one of Liam's terrible jokes, but there was a calm reserve about him that had never existed before. The older brother, I remembered, had always been the loudest person in the room. Now he seemed content simply watching everyone else enjoy themselves. Every once in a while, I caught him looking in my direction, only for him to glance away before our eyes could meet for more than a second. I told myself I was imagining it. After lunch, Liam suggested we clean out the garage because his parents wanted to organize years of forgotten boxes before the winter holidays. Naturally, the 3 of us ended up doing most of the work while Liam complained dramatically about how unfair manual labor was. The garage smelled exactly as I remembered, a mixture of old wood, cardboard, and motor oil. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight shining beneath the open garage door. We sorted holiday decorations, sports equipment, and boxes filled with family keepsakes that had not been touched in years. I reached for a faded plastic container sitting on the highest shelf when it slipped unexpectedly from my hands. Before it could hit the floor, another pair of hands caught it with surprising ease. "Careful," Mason said with a small smile. We stood closer than either of us expected. "Thanks," I replied quietly. He nodded once before setting the container safely on the workbench. Liam never even noticed the moment. He was too busy arguing with an old lawnmower that refused to move. As I opened the container, I found dozens of photographs from our childhood. Camping trips, school carnivals, backyard birthdays, summer afternoons at the lake. One picture caught my attention immediately. It showed me sitting on the old tree swing in Liam's backyard, laughing at something outside the frame, while Mason stood behind me with one hand resting lightly against the rope to keep the swing steady. I remembered that day almost perfectly. I had been terrified of falling after the rope snapped on another swing earlier that summer. Mason had quietly stayed beside me until I finally stopped being afraid. "You never threw that picture away," I said without thinking. Mason looked down at the photograph before answering. "No." His voice was softer than usual. "Some memories are worth keeping." I expected him to say something more, but instead he carefully placed the picture back inside the box as though it deserved special attention. Liam finally wandered over carrying another stack of boxes. "You found the old photos?" He laughed. "Mom still makes us look through those every Thanksgiving." He grabbed one random picture and burst into laughter. "Look at Noah's haircut." I rolled my eyes. I was 12. Exactly. Even Mason laughed this time, and hearing that familiar sound made the room feel strangely lighter. For just a moment, it almost felt like the years between us had disappeared. Later that afternoon, Liam received a phone call from a classmate about an upcoming group project and hurried upstairs to his bedroom, promising he would only be gone for 10 minutes. The house became unexpectedly quiet. I wandered onto the back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching fallen leaves drift across the backyard where we had spent so many summers growing up. A moment later, the screen door opened behind me. Mason stepped outside carrying his own drink before leaning against the porch railing several feet away. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward. Finally, he looked toward the old maple tree at the edge of the yard and smiled to himself. "You grew taller," he said with a quiet laugh. I smiled back. "That is usually what happens after 5 years." He laughed again, but this time there was something different in his expression, something thoughtful that lingered longer than the joke itself. "You changed," he admitted. Then after a brief pause, almost too quietly for me to hear, he added, "More than I expected." The conversation on the back porch lingered in my thoughts long after I drove home that evening. Mason's quiet observation should have been nothing more than a casual compliment, yet the way he had looked at me made it feel different, almost as though he had been comparing the person standing in front of him with someone he had carried in his memory for years. I told myself I was reading too much into a simple moment. After all, 5 years was a long time. Everyone changed. Classes filled the beginning of the week with lectures, assignments, and endless coffee. Still, every time my phone buzzed, I caught myself wondering if Liam wanted to make plans again or if Mason had decided to stay in town longer than anyone expected. On Wednesday afternoon, Liam finally sent a message asking if I wanted to stop by after class because his mother was making homemade chili. It sounded like the same ordinary invitation I had accepted dozens of times before, yet I noticed myself checking the mirror before leaving my apartment, something I had never done when visiting my best friend's house. I laughed quietly at myself during the drive, convinced I was being ridiculous. When I arrived, the front door stood open, and familiar music drifted from somewhere inside the house. Liam shouted that he would be downstairs in a minute because he was helping his father move furniture into the basement. I stepped into the living room and found it empty except for Mason kneeling beside a large cardboard box filled with books. He looked up and smiled naturally, as though seeing me had already improved his day. "Perfect timing," he said. "Can you help me with something?" I nodded and walked over. Together we lifted stacks of old books onto nearby shelves. Some belonged to Liam. Others were Mason's from high school and college. Between worn novels and textbooks rested a faded blue notebook with a cracked leather cover. It slipped from the stack and landed softly on the floor. I bent down to pick it up before noticing a small photograph tucked between its pages. It was another picture from years ago. Liam had taken it during a neighborhood barbecue. I was sitting on the back steps eating a slice of watermelon while laughing at something outside the frame. Mason stood several feet behind me, looking directly toward the camera instead of the food or the people around him. Somehow I had never realized his eyes were focused entirely on me. Before I could study it any longer, Mason gently reached down and closed the notebook. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable hesitation in his eyes. "Sorry," I said, handing it back. "I did not mean to look." "It is all right." He smiled politely. "I just forgot that picture was still in there." Before I could ask why he had kept it, Liam came upstairs carrying 2 heavy boxes and immediately filled the room with his usual energy. The quiet moment disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. During dinner, everyone talked about weekend plans. Liam wanted to organize another camping trip before the weather turned cold. His parents loved the idea, and within minutes, everyone agreed to spend Saturday at the same lakeside campground we had visited throughout our childhood. I noticed Mason become unusually quiet again when the old campground was mentioned. Later, as everyone cleared the table, I stepped into the kitchen to help wash dishes. Mason joined me without saying anything, handing me clean plates to dry. The comfortable silence lasted several minutes before he finally spoke. "Do you remember the last time we went camping there?" I searched my memory and smiled. "The trip when Liam accidentally dropped all of the hot dog buns into the lake." Mason laughed. "Everyone remembers that part." His smile slowly faded into something softer. "There was something else that happened after everyone went to sleep." I frowned. "I do not remember." He looked down at the plate in his hands for a long moment before quietly saying, "I never expected you would." Then he changed the subject before I could ask another question, leaving me with the strange feeling that one forgotten night from years ago might explain far more than either of us was ready to admit. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and the kind of crisp autumn air that made the entire town smell like pine trees and fallen leaves. Liam insisted we leave before sunrise because he wanted the best campsite near the lake, claiming someone always took it if we arrived too late. His parents laughed at his determination, loaded the truck with coolers, folding chairs, and camping gear, and soon the familiar drive through winding country roads brought back memories I had almost forgotten. Every mile seemed to uncover another piece of childhood tucked somewhere deep inside my mind. The wooden entrance sign to the campground looked exactly the same. The gravel paths, still curved around towering evergreens. Even the old fishing dock stretched across the quiet water without seeming to age at all. Liam rushed ahead carrying enough equipment for 3 people while complaining that nobody else appreciated proper camping preparation. His parents followed more slowly toward the picnic tables, leaving Mason and me to unload the last cooler together. "Some things never change," I said with a smile as Liam nearly tripped over a tent bag. Mason laughed softly. "That sentence describes my brother perfectly." The morning passed peacefully as everyone worked together to pitch tents, gather firewood, and prepare lunch. Every task felt strangely familiar, as though the years between childhood and adulthood had briefly disappeared. After eating, Liam suggested hiking around the lake before sunset. The trail wound through quiet woods painted with shades of orange and gold. Birds drifted overhead while sunlight filtered through the branches in gentle patterns across the ground. Liam walked several yards ahead with his father, enthusiastically pointing out every squirrel and deer track he discovered. His mother stopped often to photograph the changing leaves. Without planning it, Mason and I gradually found ourselves walking side by side near the back of the group. Neither of us seemed in any hurry to catch up. "I forgot how peaceful this place feels," I admitted. Mason nodded while looking toward the lake shimmering between the trees. "I came here once after I moved away." I looked at him with surprise. "Really? Just for one afternoon?" He smiled faintly. Nobody knew. That answer only deepened my curiosity. Before I could ask another question, we reached a small wooden overlook extending above the water. Liam immediately challenged his father to skip stones across the lake, while his mother wandered farther down the trail searching for better photographs. Mason rested both hands against the weathered railing, quietly watching the reflection of drifting clouds. I stood beside him. "Earlier this week," I said carefully, "you mentioned something happened here years ago after everyone went to sleep." His expression grew thoughtful. "Do you Really want to know? Yes. He remained silent long enough that I almost believed he had changed his mind. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and unfolded a small piece of paper that had clearly been opened many times before. The edges were worn, and the faded blue ink had begun to soften with age. He held it carefully without handing it to me. Do you remember writing this? I shook my head. He looked down at the note with an almost nostalgic smile before quietly reading one sentence aloud. When I grow up, I hope I become just like Mason. My heart skipped. I wrote that. He nodded once. You were 12. The words settled between us with unexpected weight. I searched my memory until, little by little, another forgotten image surfaced. A campfire glowing beneath the stars. Me sitting cross-legged beside a picnic table with a pencil in my hand, while Liam roasted marshmallows nearby. Mason laughing as he helped his father build the fire. I remembered folding a small note because it was part of a camping game where everyone secretly wrote about the person they admired most. The memory faded almost immediately, but not before leaving behind one unmistakable realization. Mason had carried that tiny piece of paper with him for more than 5 years, protecting it as though it had always meant far more to him than a simple childhood game. That evening, the campground settled into the peaceful rhythm that only autumn seemed capable of creating. The campfire crackled softly while the last colors of sunset disappeared beyond the lake, leaving the sky filled with countless stars. Liam insisted on making enough roasted marshmallows for everyone, laughing every time one slipped into the fire. His parents shared old family stories that I had heard since childhood, yet somehow they felt warmer beneath the open sky. Across the fire, Mason remained unusually quiet, his attention drifting between the flames and the small folded note that he had carefully tucked back into his jacket pocket earlier that afternoon. I tried not to think about it, but the image refused to leave my mind. A simple piece of paper had somehow survived 5 years in another city. Long after everyone finished dessert, Liam announced that he wanted to photograph the stars from the fishing dock. His parents decided to stay behind and organize the campsite while we walked toward the quiet shoreline together. The lake reflected the moonlight like polished glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a fish near the surface. Liam wandered farther down the dock searching for the perfect camera angle, leaving Mason and me standing near the old wooden railing exactly where we had spent countless summer evenings years before. I almost threw that note away once, Mason admitted unexpectedly. I turned toward him. What changed your mind? He smiled faintly. I unfolded it before putting it in the trash. He looked across the water before continuing. Then I realized I could not do it. I remained silent, sensing there was more he wanted to say. When I moved away, he continued. Everything happened very fast. New city, new job, new apartment. I kept telling myself I was only taking memories from home because I was homesick. He laughed quietly at himself. That explanation worked for a while. Only for a while. I asked. He nodded slowly. Eventually I noticed something. His voice became almost thoughtful. Every time life became difficult, I found myself opening that notebook and looking at the same photograph or reading the same note. My heartbeat quickened. Why? Mason did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket once again and carefully removed the faded notebook I had seen earlier that week. This time he handed it to me without hesitation. Go ahead. I opened it carefully. Between its pages rested more than the single photograph I had already seen. There were ticket stubs from our hometown baseball games, a pressed maple leaf, an old friendship bracelet with faded blue and white threads, a receipt from an ice cream shop that had closed years ago. Every item somehow connected to the summers Liam and I had spent growing up together. My eyes stopped on one final object tucked inside the back cover. It was a folded brochure from a company headquartered in Seattle. Across the top, bold letters announced a management position, with a salary far higher than anything available in our hometown. I looked up in confusion. You were offered this job? Mason nodded. Last spring. Seattle? Yes. That is almost 3,000 miles away. I know. I turned the brochure over and noticed the word declined written neatly across the front in blue ink. You turned it down? He looked out across the dark water, his expression calm but unmistakably honest. Everyone believed I came home because another position opened here. He smiled sadly. That was only part of the story. The gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the dock as silence settled between us once again. Finally, I asked the question that had quietly followed me ever since he opened the front door a week earlier. Then why did you really come back? Mason looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, one filled not with uncertainty, but with quiet acceptance. Because after 5 years of trying to build a life somewhere else, he said softly, I realized every place that ever felt like home had one thing in common. Somehow, every memory I wanted to keep always had you in it. The words lingered in the cool night air long after Mason finished speaking. Neither of us moved. The lake remained perfectly still beneath the moonlight, as though even the water had paused to listen. I searched his face, hoping to find some sign that he had exaggerated or spoken without thinking, but there was only quiet sincerity in his eyes. You came back because of me? I finally asked. Mason smiled gently, though there was uncertainty behind it. Not only because of you. He glanced toward the campground, where Liam's laughter echoed faintly through the trees. My family mattered. My hometown mattered. But every time I imagined coming home, you were always part of that picture. I looked down at the weathered wooden planks beneath my feet. My thoughts felt tangled together with memories that had suddenly begun making sense. The camping trips, the photographs he had saved, the notebook filled with ordinary moments that no one else would have considered important. None of those things happened by accident. Why did you never tell me? I asked quietly. Mason rested his hands on the railing and looked toward the stars. Because when I left, you were still a kid finishing high school. I was already starting my career. He laughed softly without humor. Whatever I felt back then belonged to me alone. You deserved the chance to grow up without someone older placing expectations on your future. His answer surprised me more than any confession could have. He had not stayed away because he stopped caring. He had stayed away because he believed that was the respectful thing to do. 5 years is a long time, I whispered. It is, he agreed. I spent most of those years convincing myself the feeling would disappear. He smiled to himself. It never did. Before I could respond, Liam's voice carried across the dock. There you two are. He jogged toward us with his camera hanging around his neck and a wide grin across his face. I have been looking everywhere. Mason immediately stepped back from the railing, and the quiet conversation disappeared as naturally as it had begun. Liam looked between us with playful suspicion before laughing. You both look way too serious for a camping trip. We were just talking, I answered. About old memories, Mason added calmly. Liam smiled. Perfect. Then you can help me settle an argument. He held up his camera. Mom says the three of us should recreate one of our old camping pictures before we leave tomorrow. The idea sounded simple enough. We walked back toward the campsite where Liam's mother excitedly searched through an old family photo album she had packed almost by coincidence. Within minutes, she found the picture she wanted. It had been taken beside the very same campfire nearly 8 years earlier. Liam stood in the middle wearing an oversized baseball cap. I sat on one side smiling at the camera, while Mason rested one hand lightly on my shoulder from behind. Stand exactly the same way, Liam's mother said cheerfully. We laughed and copied the pose. As Mason stepped behind me, his hand hesitated for the briefest moment before gently resting against my shoulder exactly where it had been years ago. The simple gesture awakened another forgotten memory. I remembered asking him that night if growing up meant leaving home forever. I remembered him smiling before answering. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it is the people you hope will still be waiting when you come back. The camera shutter clicked, pulling me back to the present. I slowly turned toward Mason, realizing that he had remembered those words all along. Judging by the quiet expression on his face, he knew I finally remembered them too. Neither of us said anything. We did not need to. For the first time since he returned, the silence between us no longer felt filled with unanswered questions. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a choice that neither of us could avoid forever. The drive home the following afternoon felt quieter than any trip I had ever taken from the campground. Liam spent most of the ride talking excitedly about editing the photographs he had taken over the weekend, completely unaware that every familiar landmark passing outside the window carried a new meaning for me. Mason sat in the passenger seat beside his brother, occasionally joining the conversation with a smile, yet every time our eyes met in the rearview mirror, the memory from the campfire returned. Home is not always a place. Sometimes it is the people you hope will still be waiting when you come back. By Monday morning, I realized concentrating on college lectures had become nearly impossible. My notebook filled with unfinished sentences instead of class notes. During lunch, Liam dropped into the empty chair across from me, carrying his usual tray piled far too high with food. He studied my face for a few seconds before pointing a French fry at me. "You have been distracted since we got back." I tried to sound casual. "Just tired." He laughed. "You are a terrible liar." I smiled awkwardly, hoping he would change the subject, but Liam knew me too well. Did something happen during the camping trip that I missed? My heartbeat quickened. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A message from Mason appeared on the screen. "Thank you for coming this weekend." I smiled without realizing it. Liam noticed immediately. That smile was definitely not because of your economics. "Professor." He leaned forward with playful curiosity. "Who texted you?" I hesitated for only a second. "Your brother." Liam blinked once, then grinned. "Well, that explains why he has been smiling more too." His words caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" Liam shrugged as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Since he came home, Mom keeps saying he looks happier than he has in years." He paused while opening a packet of ketchup. "Actually, he mostly smiles after you leave." I stared at him without knowing how to respond. Liam finally looked up and noticed my expression. His grin slowly faded into confusion. "Wait." He set his fork down. "Did I just accidentally say something important?" The silence between us suddenly felt much heavier than either of us expected. Before I could think of an answer, Liam's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and smiled. "It is Mason." He answered immediately. "Hey, what is up?" I tried not to listen, but it became impossible when Liam unexpectedly looked toward me. "Really?" he asked into the phone. "You are asking if Noah wants to come over for dinner again?" He laughed. "You could just text him yourself." Another pause followed. Liam's expression gradually shifted from amusement to thoughtful curiosity. "All right, I will ask." He ended the call and placed the phone on the table without speaking for several moments. Finally, he looked directly at me. "This is probably going to sound strange." I waited. "Mason almost never asks anyone to come over." He smiled uncertainly. "Especially not twice in 1 week." My pulse refused to settle. "Maybe he just wants to spend time with family." Liam nodded slowly, but something in his eyes suggested he was beginning to connect pieces that had never mattered before. "Maybe." He looked out the cafeteria window before quietly adding, "Or maybe I've been missing something that has been standing right in front of me for years." Neither of us spoke again for the rest of lunch. As I walked toward my afternoon class, I could not stop replaying Liam's final sentence in my mind. For the first time since Mason returned home, I realized the person I had feared. Disappointing, most might already be closer to understanding the truth than either of us had ever imagined. That evening I arrived at the Brooks family home carrying nothing more than a small dessert from the neighborhood bakery, yet my thoughts felt heavier than anything in my hands. Liam answered the door with his usual grin, immediately pulling me inside. While talking about a documentary he wanted everyone to watch after dinner. His parents welcomed me as warmly as always, and for a few minutes I managed to believe everything would remain comfortably ordinary. Then Mason walked into the kitchen carrying a tray of drinks, and our eyes met for only a brief moment before we both looked away. Somehow even that simple glance felt different now that the truth had finally been spoken between us. Dinner unfolded with laughter, family stories, and Liam's endless attempts to convince his parents that he deserved a newer car. Mason joined the conversation naturally, yet I noticed the quiet relief in his expression every time the discussion drifted away from us. When everyone finished eating, Liam's mother asked Mason to help her carry empty serving dishes into the kitchen while Liam disappeared upstairs to find the documentary. I followed a few moments later, intending to help clear the table, but I stopped just outside the kitchen doorway when I heard familiar voices. "You know," Liam's mother said gently, "I have not seen you smile this much since high school." Mason laughed softly. "Maybe being home helps." "Maybe," she answered knowingly. "Or maybe someone else does." A quiet silence followed. I should have walked away, yet my feet refused to move. Finally Mason spoke in a calm voice filled with quiet honesty. "I never planned for any of this." "I know," his mother replied. "You also never stopped talking about Noah whenever you came home to visit." My heart skipped. I thought I hid it better than that. She laughed affectionately. "Only from yourself." I quietly stepped back before either of them noticed me standing nearby. Moments later, Liam came bounding downstairs carrying a stack of old family photo albums instead of the documentary he had promised. Forget the movie, he announced. Mom said we should look through these first. Everyone gathered around the living room coffee table as photographs from birthdays, camping trips, school plays, and neighborhood celebrations covered the room. We laughed at terrible hairstyles, outdated clothes, and awkward childhood smiles until Liam suddenly paused with one particular picture in his hand. It showed the three of us standing beneath the old maple tree in the backyard years earlier. Liam looked closely at the photograph before turning it toward his parents. "That is funny." "What is?" his father asked. Liam pointed toward Mason. "Look where he is looking." The room became unexpectedly quiet. In the photograph, Liam and I were smiling directly at the camera. Mason was not. His eyes were resting on me instead. Liam slowly flipped through several more pictures taken years apart. Birthday parties, baseball games, school graduations, camping trips. The pattern never changed. Mason was almost always looking toward me instead of the camera. Liam lowered the photographs onto the table and looked at his older brother with an expression filled more with surprise than anger. "How long?" he asked quietly. Mason took a slow breath before answering. "Long enough that I spent years hoping it would disappear." Nobody interrupted him. It never did. Liam looked at me next. "And you?" I met my best friend's eyes with complete honesty. I only understood my own feelings after he came home. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, Liam leaned back against the couch and let out one long breath before shaking his head with a small, almost unbelievable smile. "I spent years thinking I knew everything happening inside this house." He laughed quietly at himself. "Turns out I was the last person to figure it out." He looked from me to Mason before speaking again. "I am not upset because you care about each other." His voice remained calm. "I only needed to know that neither of you was hiding something unfair." Mason answered without hesitation. "That is exactly why I stayed away for so long. I wanted Noah to grow into his own life before either of us had to make this choice." Liam studied his brother for another moment before standing up and pulling both of us into an awkward but unmistakably genuine hug. "Next time," he said with a laugh, "please remember that I am your family too. You never had to carry all of this alone." Life did not transform overnight after that conversation in the Brooks family's living room, and perhaps that was what made everything feel so genuine. Nothing dramatic happened the next morning. The sun still rose over the same quiet neighborhood. Classes still filled my weekdays with assignments and deadlines. Liam still sent me ridiculous memes at 7 o'clock every morning because he believed everyone should begin the day laughing. Yet beneath those familiar routines, something had quietly changed forever. There were no more unanswered questions between Mason and me. There was no longer any reason to hide behind old memories or unspoken feelings. Instead, we allowed ourselves the simple gift of getting to know each other again, not as the older brother and the kid who had followed him around every summer, but as two adults choosing to move forward with honesty. Weeks passed, and the entire Brooks family settled naturally into the new rhythm. Liam continued treating me exactly as he always had, except now he occasionally rolled his eyes whenever he caught Mason finding another excuse to spend time with me. "You know," he joked one Saturday afternoon while we cleaned the backyard together, "it took me years to realize my best friend and my brother were somehow the two most patient people on the planet." Mason laughed. "Why?" Liam pointed dramatically toward us. "Because normal people would have figured this out much sooner." Even his parents smiled, and the laughter that followed carried none of the uncertainty that had once surrounded us. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. One crisp evening, Mason asked if I wanted to take a walk before the town's annual holiday tree lighting ceremony. We wandered through familiar streets decorated with white lights, wreaths, and small neighborhood displays that had welcomed families every December for as long as I could remember. Children laughed while building snowmen in front yards. Coffee shops filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and fresh pastries. Everything about the evening felt comfortably familiar, yet entirely new at the same time. Eventually, we found ourselves standing beneath the old maple tree outside the Brooks family home, the same tree that had appeared in countless photographs from our childhood. Its branches were bare now, stretching quietly into the winter sky. Mason reached into the pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded the faded note I had written all those years ago at the campground. The paper looked even older than I remembered, but the blue handwriting remained perfectly readable. He smiled before handing it to me. "I think it belongs to you now." I looked at the worn edges for several moments before gently folding it again. "No." I placed it back into his hand. "It helped bring you home. You should keep it." He looked at me with the same quiet warmth I had first noticed the afternoon he unexpectedly opened the front door weeks earlier. "Then we will keep it together." Snowflakes began drifting softly through the evening air, settling across the front lawn and the empty sidewalk. Without another word, we started walking toward the holiday lights where Liam and his parents were already waving for us to hurry before the ceremony began. As we crossed the street, I looked back once at the old house, the front porch, the familiar mailbox, and the maple tree that had silently witnessed every stage of our story. Years earlier, I believed growing up meant leaving home behind forever. Now I finally understood what Mason had tried to teach me all those summers ago. Home was never only the place where memories began. Home was the people who chose to keep those memories alive until the day you were ready to return to them. Standing beside Mason, surrounded by the family that had quietly supported both of us all along, I realized that sometimes the longest journey is not measured in miles or years. Sometimes it is measured by the courage to come back, the patience to wait, and the quiet certainty that the right people will still be there when you finally arrive.